The challenge of alcohol use disorder, or AUD, it's just so widespread, isn't it?
Yeah.
Affecting millions and really creating this urgent need for more treatment options, better options maybe, beyond the standard ones like naltrexone or camprosate.
Absolutely. I mean, those existing treatments are definitely valuable. They help a lot of people, but the research is pretty clear. They don't work for everyone, and even when they do, sometimes the effect isn't, as strong as you would hope.
Right.
Plus, sticking with treatment, that can be a real hurdle for many. So, yeah, there's definitely a clear need for a wider toolkit of therapies.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our source material, it comes from some really comprehensive research looking at interventions for AUD. And it includes this fascinating look at traditional herbal medicines, but also some, well, pretty novel biochemical targets that researchers are just starting to explore.
Yeah, so our mission here, really, is to explore a whole range of these substances. You've got botanicals used for centuries, and then compounds identified much more recently. We're going to dig into what these sources actually say about how they might work in the body, the mechanisms.
Okay.
And the evidence, crucially, what's the proof they work? How safe are they? And this is important. We need to be really clear about the difference between, say, what happens in a petri dish or in animal studies versus actual human clinical trials.
Big difference there.
Huge. Ultimately, we want to unpack what all this research might mean for potential future treatments. Treatments for reducing drinking, tackling those intense cravings, and easing the really difficult withdrawal symptoms.
Right. And the research makes something very clear right from the start. AUD is incredibly complex. It's not just one single thing going wrong, is it?
Not at all. It involves multiple brain systems, all interconnected. You've got GABA, which is generally calming, glutamate, more on the excitatory side, dopamine and serotonin, tied up in reward and mood, even opioid receptors and the body's stress response system, the HPA axis.
Wow. Okay, so it's hitting a lot of different pathways.
Exactly. And because it's so multifaceted, the idea of finding one single magic bullet treatment that works perfectly for everyone, it seems, pretty unlikely based on what we know.
Yeah.
A more multifaceted approach probably makes more sense, maybe combining treatments or using things that target different parts of the problem. This complexity really is the why behind researchers looking at such a diverse range of potential remedies, everything from ancient plant wisdom to these cutting-edge molecular targets.
It really highlights that treatment probably needs to be more personalized down the line, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where it's heading. For some people, AUD might be driven more by stress. For others, it might be more about the reward pathways, or maybe the severity of withdrawal is the biggest factor. Exploring this wide range gives us more potential tools, hopefully, to match the treatment to the individual's specific needs and the underlying biology driving their alcohol use.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. We're kicking off our journey on the botanical trail, looking at some herbs with a long history that are now getting some serious scientific scrutiny.
Yeah.
First up, a big one in this space. Kudzu, Puraria lobata.
Kudzu, yeah.
Yeah.
It has this remarkably long history, we're talking centuries, in traditional Chinese medicine, and it was used specifically for issues related to alcohol consumption, which is fascinating in itself.
Right.
The research highlights its key active components are these compounds called isoflavones, particularly two called daidzein and purarin.
And how might kudzu actually work? The proposed mechanisms sound quite interesting, maybe pointing in a couple of different directions.
Yeah, there are a few ideas. One key theory focuses on daidzein. So, the thinking is that daidzein might inhibit an enzyme in your body called ALDH2. Now, think of ALDH2 as like a critical worker in your body's alcohol processing plant. When you drink alcohol, your liver first turns it into this toxic stuff called acetaldehyde.
Right, the nasty byproduct.
Exactly. ALDH2 is the enzyme that's supposed to quickly break down this acetaldehyde into harmless acetate. If daidzein blocks or inhibits this enzyme, that toxic acetaldehyde starts to build up.
And that's not good.
Definitely not. That buildup causes really unpleasant symptoms, flushing, nausea, headache. Basically, it feels like a really fast, intense hangover hitting you almost immediately. It's the same principle behind the medication disulfiram, actually.
Oh, okay.
But some research suggests kudzu's effect might be maybe a bit less severe, potentially better tolerated. The idea is that this aversive reaction could help reduce drinking by making the whole experience less rewarding or even downright unpleasant.
So it could kind of act as a deterrent, making you feel sick if you drink. But the research also hints it might be doing more than just that, right? It's not just about feeling bad.
Exactly. That's a crucial point. The sources also mention the idea that kudzu's Isoflavones might increase blood flow in the brain, cerebral blood flow.
How would that help?
Well, it sounds a bit indirect, but better blood flow could potentially influence neurotransmitter systems in the brain that are involved in AUD. And significantly, the research notes that some evidence suggests the reduction in drinking seen with kudzu isn't simply because people feel more drunk or sick.
Interesting.
Yeah, it really suggests there might be other mechanisms at play, something beyond just that ALDH2 inhibition. Maybe it's influencing pathways related to alcohol's effects or metabolism in a more complex way, perhaps even touching on those reward systems we mentioned earlier.
But complexity is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond these ideas about how it might work, what does the actual evidence say? Particularly from human studies, the sources mention several important trials.
They do. There's a notable placebo-controlled study. They took individuals who were prone to binge drinking, gave them 2 grams of a standardized kudzu extract about 2.5 hours before, well, an opportunity to drink in a lab setting.
And what happened?
Compared to when they got a placebo, the kudzu group significantly reduced the amount of alcohol they consumed. And that's important, right? Because it's targeting a specific, really problematic drinking pattern, binging.
Yeah, showing it works in a relevant situation.
Exactly, demonstrating efficacy there. Then there was another study mentioned. This one involved heavy drinkers, both men and women, who took kudzu extract for 7 days straight.
And they were also observed in a lab.
Precisely. They brought them into a lab setting where drinking could be carefully monitored, and that study found a significant reduction in the number of beers the kudzu group consumed. But what was really fascinating, and this is a specific detail the source highlights, was how their drinking topography changed.
Drinking topography sounds technical. What does that mean in practice?
It refers to the actual way someone drinks. So the speed they drink at, how many sips they take from each drink, how big those sips are, and how long they wait between finishing one drink and starting the next.
Oh, okay. The pattern of drinking.
Exactly. And the research reported that the people taking kudzu, well, they drank more slowly, they took more sips per beer, but the sips were smaller, and they took longer breaks between beers.
That's really interesting. So it's not just that they felt sick and stopped. It's like it changed the habit of drinking itself.
It seems like it. It suggests kudzu might be subtly influencing the actual process, maybe the automatic behaviors around drinking. For someone trying to cut back or get control, changing how fast and how much they're taking in with each sip, that could be a really significant help.
That points to maybe a shift in those automatic, almost subconscious drinking behaviors. The sources also mention a smaller test, I think led by the BBC. It reported about a 21% reduction in alcohol units.
Yes, though they did note challenges there with standardizing the kudzu products and just getting hold of consistent ones, which is, a common issue with herbal supplements.
Yeah, that highlights a critical point, doesn't it? The quality and consistency of these things can vary wildly. It makes it hard to know if you're getting the right dose of the active stuff.
Absolutely. That's why standardized extracts used in research are so important, and why, more regulated products would really be needed for wider clinical use.
There was also another study mentioned. This one was in heavy drinkers who weren't even in formal treatment. It showed kudzu led to reductions in weekly drinks quite significantly, by like a third to a half.
Wow.
Yeah, and fewer heavy drinking days, plus an increase in days they didn't drink at all.
That's interesting because it suggests kudzu might potentially be helpful even for people trying to moderate their drinking outside of a formal treatment setting, maybe as a harm reduction tool or a first step towards getting more help, though obviously formal medical advice is always recommended for AUD.
Always. Now let's talk about craving, because that's such a huge driver of AUD, isn't it? The sources seemed a bit mixed on this one.
Yeah, a little bit. Some of the individual studies reported finding no effect on self-reported craving levels, but then a big 2019 Cochrane meta-analysis which pooled data from several studies together.
Right, combining the results.
Exactly. That meta-analysis did suggest a potential reduction in cravings with kudzu.
So why the difference?
Well, meta-analyses have more statistical power because they combine data, so they might pick up smaller effects that individual studies miss. Also, it's possible that craving was measured differently across the studies, or maybe the participant groups were slightly different.
Okay.
It means the picture on craving isn't perfectly crystal clear, but the aggregate data, looking at everything together, does lean towards a potential benefit there. The odds ratio was nearly 3, which is pretty suggestive, and they called it moderate certainty evidence.
The research also detailed a specific pilot study using just pure Raisin, one of those main isoflavones from kudzu, right? A purified form.
Yes, they gave participants 1,200 milligrams daily for just 1 week. And it showed a reduction in average beer consumption dropped from about 3.5 beers down to 2.4. And importantly, it confirmed those changes in drinking topography we talked about earlier, the slower sipping, etc.
So that helps pin down purine as likely one of the key active ingredients doing the work.
Seems like it. It's valuable because it helps confirm that purine is probably a major player in the effects seen with the whole kudzu extract. That helps narrow the focus for future research, maybe even drug development based on it.
And they mentioned researchers are even looking into synthetic versions of Raisin, potentially designed to stop that dopamine increase you get from alcohol.
Exactly. That connects back to the idea that kudzu might be influencing brain reward pathways directly, not just causing that acetaldehyde buildup. Targeting dopamine is a more direct central nervous system approach, quite different from the peripheral ALDH2 inhibition.
And synthetic versions could offer more precision.
Right. Better dose control, maybe fewer unwanted side effects compared to the whole plant extract.
Finally, the research notes there's still an ongoing trial, the AHIKI trial, actively looking at kudzu.
Yeah, that tells you there's continued scientific interest. People recognize that despite the promising pilot data, we still need those larger, more rigorous trials to really nail down these findings, understand long-term effects, and figure out where kudzu might fit into evidence-based AUD treatment.
And what about safety in those trials?
Good question. The research indicates that in the specific clinical trials they detailed, the standardized kudzu extract they used was reported to have no significant side effects.
Okay, good to know, at least in those controlled settings. Right, let's switch gears now to another traditional remedy that's getting a lot of scientific buzz. Japanese raisin tree, Hovvenia dulcis, and its main active compound, dihydromyricidin, or DHM. A lot of listeners might have heard of DHM for hangovers.
Yes, that's definitely where it's most known commercially. But the sources really highlight its potential for treating AUD itself, which is obviously a much bigger clinical target. Hovvenia dulcis is another one with a rich history in traditional Asian medicine.
And DHM seems particularly compelling because it looks like it might work in two different ways, both in the body and directly in the brain.
That dual action is a key insight from the research, yeah. On the peripheral side, meaning mostly outside the brain, in the liver, DHM seems to activate those same alcohol metabolizing enzymes we discussed, ADH and ALDH.
So it helps break down alcohol faster.
Essentially, yes, which helps the body clear alcohol more quickly. That's thought to be why it helps with hangovers. And this process also likely contributes to its potential for hepatoprotection, basically, protecting the liver from alcohol damage.
But it also works directly in the brain.
Yeah.
That sounds really significant for AUD.
It really does. This is where the research gets particularly exciting. DHM has been shown to interact directly with GABA receptors in the brain. Now, alcohol strongly enhances these GABA receptors. That's a big part of why it's intoxicating and sedating.
Yeah.
DHM appears to antagonize or block ethanol's ability to overstimulate these receptors. And maybe even more importantly, the research suggests DHM can actually help reverse some of the changes in these receptors caused by long-term chronic alcohol exposure. Things like the upregulation of a specific part, the alpha-4 subunit, which is linked to tolerance and withdrawal symptoms. The sources even mention it seems to interact with the same binding sites on the GABA receptor as benzodiazepines do.
Wow. So it's like DHM is trying to help normalize the brain's response that alcohol is kind of hijacked.
That's a good way to put it. By counteracting alcohol's immediate effects at the GABA receptor and maybe helping to undo some of those chronic adaptations, DHM could potentially counteract acute intoxication and, really importantly, alleviate withdrawal symptoms directly, centrally in the brain.
That could be incredibly valuable during that really difficult and often dangerous withdrawal period.
Absolutely. And the sources also mention another plant, Ampelopsis grossidentata, sometimes called vine tea, which is also rich in DHM. Animal studies suggest it might help with chronic alcohol-induced liver damage, things like fatty liver, oxidative stress, inflammation, possibly through a specific signaling pathway.
So the potential benefit looks twofold: helping the liver handle alcohol and recover from damage, and potentially fixing some of the core brain changes that drive dependence and withdrawal. What's the evidence look like? The sources mention substantial preclinical evidence.
Right. Across lots of different animal models, DHM has pretty consistently shown it can counteract acute alcohol intoxication, reduce how much alcohol animals choose to drink voluntarily, and, importantly, ease withdrawal symptoms like tolerance, anxiety, even those dangerous withdrawal-induced seizures. The research really emphasizes that this preclinical data is quite robust and all points in the same direction, supporting both the direct anti-alcohol effects and the liver protection.
And we do see some human clinical trials mentioned, though mostly for hangover relief, which fits with that metabolic mechanism, right? Helping break down alcohol faster.
Exactly. Studies with Hovvenia dulcis extract showed people's blood alcohol levels dropped faster, and they had fewer hangover symptoms like nausea. One trial specifically linked this to increased ADH and ALDH activity.
So those hangover trials are useful for basic safety and showing it works metabolically in humans.
Yeah, they lay some groundwork. But for its potential as a formal AUD treatment, the really big development highlighted in the sources is that planned phase 1 human clinical trial, specifically looking at DHM for alcohol-associated liver disease, or ALD.
This is the one mentioned as planned but not yet recruiting.
Yes, that's the one. And the purpose of this trial is absolutely fundamental if DHM is going to move towards being a recognized treatment. They need to establish its safety profile in humans, figure out its pharmacokinetics, how the body handles it, absorbs it, gets rid of it, and find the maximum tolerated dose.
Crucial steps for any potential new medicine.
Absolutely critical, especially because DHM is currently sold as an unregulated supplement. Given its promise from the preclinical side, it really warrants this kind of rigorous testing.
And this first trial is in healthy volunteers.
Right, standard for phase 1. You start in healthy people to see how the compound behaves on its own without other health conditions complicating the picture. They'll start with low doses, like 300 milligrams, and carefully increase maybe up to 900 milligrams, sometimes combined with lysine, to find that safe and potentially effective dose range.
The sources also mentioned a small trial in China for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but they specifically noted a lack of published control human studies looking at DHM for AUD outcomes, like reducing drinking or craving.
And that's the key takeaway right now regarding the human evidence specifically for AUD. The preclinical data is strong, the ALD trial is a great step, but those rigorous human trials directly testing if DHM helps people with AUD drink less or crave less. Based on these sources, that evidence isn't there yet.
Safety, then, is a big focus of that upcoming trial, but it seemed okay in the hangover studies.
Generally, yes. The hangover relief trials reported good general safety, but establishing the formal safety profile for therapeutic doses in the context of potential long-term use for AUD or ALD is exactly what that phase 1 trial is designed to do.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Some substances might help AUD indirectly by tackling related issues like stress and mood, which are so often tangled up with drinking. First one here, ashwagandha, Withania somnifera.
Ashwagandha, yeah, that's a really well-known herb. It's classified as an adaptogen. Adaptogens are traditionally thought to help the body sort of cope with stress better, find balance.
And the idea is they work by modulating the HPA axis, the body's main stress response system. The sources also mentioned GABA action.
Correct. Ashwagandha definitely has an established reputation, backed by clinical trials cited in the sources, for reducing general stress and anxiety. And this is super relevant to AUD because stress, anxiety, sleep problems, these are huge issues for people with AUD. They're often major triggers for drinking in the first place and big reasons for relapse after stopping.
So if ashwagandha can manage those, it could be a significant indirect support.
Absolutely. But the research also points to maybe more direct effects too. There was a preclinical study mentioned, Kalra and colleagues in 2020, looking at ashwagandha extract in rats going through alcohol withdrawal.
And what did they find?
This study is important because it wasn't just about general stress. It looked right at the acute symptoms of withdrawal, which can be severe and drive relapse. They found the ashwagandha extract significantly reduced withdrawal symptoms in the rats, including things like seizures and agitation.
Wow, comparable to standard treatments.
In some cases, yeah, the effects were comparable to diazepam, which is a common medication used for severe alcohol withdrawal. This suggests ashwagandha might be having a direct effect on the neurobiology that gets disrupted during withdrawal, not just a general calming effect.
And the mention that people actively drinking often have lower GABA levels, that reinforces why ashwagandha's potential GABA effects could be relevant.
It does, yeah. It connects a potential mechanism of the herb to a known neurobiological change seen in people struggling with alcohol. Suggests it could potentially help normalize that deficit. There was also a preclinical report suggesting chronic ashwagandha use might reduce alcohol consumption in mice, but again, that's animal data.
But, and this seems to be a pattern, the sources highlighted a clinical gap, right?
Yes. A lack of direct human clinical trials detailed in these sources that specifically tested ashwagandha for reducing alcohol consumption or craving as the main goal in people with AUD. They mention a trial looking at stress anxiety, which is related, but not specifically measuring the impact on drinking itself.
So promising preclinical stuff, especially for withdrawal and stress. But we need those direct human AUD trials.
That's the picture from these sources. Ashwagandha's promise seems to lie primarily in managing withdrawal distress and stress-induced relapse. Makes it a really interesting candidate for more direct AUD research down the line.
Next up in this category is passion flower, Passiflora incarnata, known for calming effects.
Yeah, passion flower is traditionally used for things like nervous restlessness, promoting relaxation. And like ashwagandha and DHM, the plausible mechanism seems to involve the GABA system, that main calming neurotransmitter system.
And there are human studies supporting its general anti-anxiety effects.
Yes, the sources mention some. A 2017 study in people with nervous restlessness showed improvements in resilience, quality of life, less restlessness, better sleep, reduced fear, and importantly, it was well tolerated.
Again, relevant because anxiety, poor sleep, restlessness are big issues in AUD.
Exactly. If passion flower helps manage those, it could indirectly support recovery. There was also a 2020 systematic review of clinical trials showing it reduced anxiety levels without some of the side effects you might get with conventional anti-anxiety meds, like memory problems.
And some broader support from related species.
Right. A preclinical study, possibly quite recent, on a different Passiflora species, showed anti-anxiety effects in mice. That lends some support to the idea that the genus has activity here, though effects can vary a lot between species. Historically, passion flower was even proposed for alcohol withdrawal based on observations in opiate withdrawal studies.
But same story again, a gap in direct human AUD trials.
Based on the sources provided, yes. A significant gap in direct human clinical trial evidence from the last decade or so, specifically testing passion flower for reducing alcohol urge or binge drinking in people with AUD.
So, potential indirect benefits for anxiety and sleep, but direct evidence for AUD behaviors is lacking in these sources.
That seems to be the assessment. Managing related symptoms might be its main potential role, according to this research.
Okay, finally in this group, looking at mood and stress, St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, widely known for depression.
Yes, St. John's wort works by modulating levels of key neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. These are all critical for mood, reward, stress, and all get dysregulated in AUD.
And it's pretty well established for mild to moderate depression, right?
Right.
The sources cited a meta-analysis comparing it to SSRIs.
Right. A 2017 meta-analysis found it was comparable in efficacy to standard SSRI antidepressants, and people were actually less likely to drop out of treatment with St. John's wort. The indirect link to AUD is logical here. If someone's drinking is driven by trying to self-medicate depression,
then treating the depression might reduce the drive to drink.
exactly. Address the underlying mood disorder, potentially lessen the need for alcohol. The sources also mention older preclinical animal studies suggesting it reduced alcohol intake and withdrawal symptoms in those models.
But, and this is critical based on the sources, they state clearly no human clinical trials found from 2014-2025 looking directly at St. John's wort for reducing alcohol urge or consumption in AUD.
That direct human evidence in the target population within that recent time frame is just absent from the materials provided. And with St. John's wort, safety becomes a really major concern that the sources strongly emphasize.
Yes, this sounds like a big caveat. What are the main safety issues?
Several serious ones are detailed. First, it can interact directly with alcohol, potentially increasing dizziness and drowsiness. But more critically, St. John's wort acts as an MAO inhibitor.
Like we discussed before.
Yes, and this means it can interact dangerously with foods high in tyramine. The sources specifically call out aged cheeses, cured meats, and, importantly for this context, red wine and tap beer. Combining St. John's wort with these can trigger a hypertensive crisis, a sudden, dangerous spike in blood pressure.
Wow. So combining it with the very thing someone with AUD might be consuming could be incredibly risky.
Extremely risky. On top of that, St. John's wort is a potent inducer of a major liver enzyme system called CYP3A4. Think of CYP3A4 as like the body's main engine for breaking down dozens of common prescription drugs.
So St. John's wort speeds up that engine.
Exactly. It makes the liver break down those other medications much faster than normal. This can drastically lower the levels of those drugs in the body, potentially making them ineffective or much less effective.
That could be a huge problem if someone's taking medications for other conditions.
A massive problem. The sources really hammer home the point. Natural does not mean safe, especially not in complex conditions like AUD, where people often have other health issues and might be taking multiple medications.
That's a critical warning. Always, always talk to a doctor or pharmacist before taking any supplement, especially St. John's wort, if you're on other meds or dealing with AUD.
Essential advice. The potential for dangerous interactions is very real here.
Okay, moving into section 3. Here we're looking at botanicals, where the research points more towards roles in liver support, metabolism, other traditional uses. The link to directly cutting drinking or craving seems less direct, or maybe mostly preclinical right now. First, thyme, Thymus vulgaris.
Thyme, yeah, common herb, used traditionally for lots of things. In the context of alcohol withdrawal, the sources highlight its significant antioxidant effects. Withdrawal is a time of huge oxidative stress on the body.
Right.
Animal studies show thyme extract seems to help counteract this. It decreases markers of damage like MDA and nitric oxide, while boosting the body's own antioxidant defenses like glutathione and catalase.
And this antioxidant action is linked to protecting the brain and liver.
That's the idea. Neuroprotective and hepatoprotective properties linked to reducing the damage from neurotoxicity and oxidative stress that happens when GABA and glutamate get out of balance during withdrawal.
There was a specific mouse study mentioned.
Yes, quite detailed in the sources. It showed thyme extract significantly reduced alcohol withdrawal symptoms in mice. This included things like reducing anxiety-like behaviors, improving memory function, less neuron damage in the hippocampus, a brain area really vulnerable to alcohol, and less damage to liver cells.
So, noticeable benefits in the animal model.
Right. The doses they used showed significant effects, and the researchers concluded this might offer some scientific backing for its traditional use in alcohol-related problems.
But the crucial point again, no human clinical trial data for thyme and AUD or withdrawal detailed in these sources.
Correct. So based on this research, the picture is promising preclinical evidence suggesting it might help support the body, especially the brain and liver, during withdrawal, likely through those antioxidant actions. But human proof is missing.
Next, geranium, the Geranium shidanum, investigated for liver protection.
The mechanism here seems to involve polyphenolic compounds, especially tannins, which have antioxidant activity. The idea is they protect the liver from ethanol toxicity by helping modulate the body's redox balance and reducing lipid peroxidation that's damage to cell membranes from oxidative stress.
And there was a detailed rat study mentioned, looking at liver damage during regeneration.
Yes. In that animal model, giving rats geranium extract showed significant liver protection. Fewer animals died, their livers regenerated better, liver enzymes like ALT and AST normalized, protein levels, albumin, were maintained or increased, and markers of damage like bilirubin and TBRs went down.
Strong preclinical evidence for liver protection then.
Seems so. The study also suggested it might affect glucose and lipid metabolism. However, the sources are explicit. No direct studies were found on geranium's ability to reduce alcohol consumption or craving. The focus here is purely liver protection.
So maybe a potential add-on therapy for liver health in AUD, but not something to directly change drinking behavior based on this evidence.
That appears to be the case based on these sources. Traditional uses are noted, but specific safety data for using it in AUD isn't detailed.
Agal mormellos, or bale, used extensively in traditional Indian medicine.
Right. This fruit-bearing tree is packed with phytochemicals, alkaloids, tannins, coumarins, terpenoids. These are thought to contribute to its traditional uses: antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, liver protective, anti-diabetic effects. Interestingly, one study in mice found an extract of the leaves had antidepressant-like activity, possibly involving the GABA system.
Traditional uses are mentioned, plus a fermented drink made from it.
Yes, noted for high antioxidant content. But again, the sources state clearly, no direct studies are provided investigating if bale actually helps reduce alcohol consumption or cravings in people with AUD. That potential link to GABA and alcohol effects is purely speculative, based just on that one mouse study showing antidepressant-like effects.
Safety is kind of inferred from traditional use, but nothing specific for AUD mentioned.
Correct. So, limited direct evidence for AUD in these sources. Any potential relevance is speculative.
Monoluma quadrangula. This one was discussed for protecting the stomach.
Yes, a succulent plant, traditional use for things like diabetes and peptic ulcers. The research highlighted a study in rats showing a hydroalcoholic extract offered significant gastroprotection against stomach injury caused by ethanol.
How to do that?
It seemed to increase protective factors like stomach pH and mucus, boost antioxidant enzymes, decrease damage markers like MDA, and influence cellular stress proteins. Ethanolic extracts also showed anti-diabetic effects in animal models.
So clear protective effect on the stomach lining against alcohol damage in rats.
Yes, the evidence presented is focused squarely on that gastroprotective and anti-diabetic potential. But the sources state clearly there's no direct information linking this plant to modulating the brain systems involved in AUD or reducing drinking or craving.
Safety seemed generally okay, but maybe some nausea or bowel issues.
Yeah, considered generally well-tolerated but potential side effects noted, and info lacking for pregnancy lactation. So evidence points to stomach diabetes effects, not direct AUD behavioral effects based on these sources.
Sorghum bicolor, a common food crop. Some in vitro liver protection findings.
Right, widely consumed grain. Lab studies on human liver cells, HepG2 cells, showed that extracts from sorghum could protect these cells against alcohol-induced damage, reducing things like reactive oxygen species and MDA.
And that's in vitro in cells in a dish, not in the whole organism.
Correct, a lab study. The sources mention this finding and some other studies on sorghum, but nothing directly on AUD efficacy.
And again, the clear statement. No direct studies in these sources assessing if sorghum extracts reduce voluntary drinking, craving, or withdrawal in AUD.
Exactly. Evidence is limited to that in vitro liver cell protection. No human or in vivo animal data on AUD behaviors presented here. Safety is generally assumed because it's food, but safety of specific extracts for AUD treatment isn't detailed.
Finally in this section, milk thistle, Psilocybin marianum. Probably the most famous traditional liver aid.
Definitely well known. Its main compound is silymarin. Its proposed mechanism is primarily about helping liver cells repair and protecting them from toxins, including those from alcohol. The sources suggest maybe an indirect benefit for AUD. If your liver works better, maybe you feel less fatigue or have fewer GI issues, which could bolster your resolve to cut back drinking. But no strong indication it directly affects the urge to drink.
And the sources noted that a lot of the evidence people cite is actually quite old, predating 2014.
Yes, and critically, they highlight a more recent systematic review from February 2022 by Rambaldi et al. This big review looked at many studies and could not demonstrate significant effects of milk thistle on mortality or complications of liver disease in people with alcoholic or hepatitis-related liver problems.
Wow. So even for its main claim, liver protection in alcoholic liver disease, recent rigorous evidence is inconclusive.
That's what this review suggests. The sources themselves say the evidence for milk thistle's effectiveness, even for liver protection in AUD, remains inconclusive. And they emphasize that stopping drinking is by far the most effective thing for liver health in this situation. Crucially, they state the sources mention no role for milk thistle in directly reducing alcohol urge or consumption.
So the overall take from these sources is maybe considered for liver support, but even there the evidence is shaky, especially recently.
Yeah.
And definitely no evidence presented for it directly affecting AUD behaviors.
That sums it up for this group of botanicals based on the research provided. Lots of traditional use, some preclinical hints, but often lacking that robust human clinical data for AUD outcomes.
Right. Let's move to section 4 now. This covers some less explored compounds, novel ones, or those with major safety warnings, starting with Paganum harmala, or Syrian rue.
This plant contains harmala alkaloids like harmine and harmaline. Their proposed mechanisms are quite powerful. They're potent reversible inhibitors of the enzyme MAOA.
MAOA, that breaks down key neurotransmitters.
Exactly. Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. Inhibiting MAOA increases the levels of these chemicals in the brain synapses. They also interact with various receptors, serotonin, dopamine, even opioid receptors. Desoxypagani is another specific alkaloid mentioned.
What's the evidence? Some preclinical work?
Yes, a study where desoxypaganin decreased ethanol consumption in rats bred to prefer alcohol. Also, preclinical antidepressant effects of harmine, which fits with the MAOA inhibition. The opioid receptor interaction is interesting too. Animal studies show its pain-relieving effects can be blocked by naloxone, an opioid blocker.
Complex interactions mentioned too.
Yeah, ethanol suppressing harmaline-induced tremors in mice, suggesting complex interplay, and some complexity around related compounds and enzymes that might be altered in alcoholism. But here's the big point.
No human clinical trials for AUD detailed in the sources.
Exactly. And this brings us immediately to the critical safety
It
concerns.
sounds serious.
Extremely. The sources detail significant safety issues. Paganum harmala is psychoactive. It alters consciousness and can be toxic, even fatal, at high doses. But the major risk, especially relevant for AUDs, stems from that potent MAO inhibition.
Right. Same issue as St. John's wort, maybe even stronger.
The generally considered stronger, yes. This means huge risks of dangerous interactions with tyramine-rich foods again, aged cheeses, cured meats, red wine, tap beer potentially causing that hypertensive crisis, and massive risks of interactions with countless other medications, antidepressants, pain meds, even over-the-counter cold remedies. These could lead to serotonin syndrome or hypertensive crisis, both potentially life-threatening.
So incredibly dangerous without strict medical supervision.
Absolutely. The sources mention one study where pharmaceutical-grade harmine was tolerated at a specific low dose in healthy adults, but that does not negate the widespread, serious food and drug interaction risks in the real world, especially for someone with AUD who might have other health issues or be on medications.
And the sources briefly connected this to ibogaine, another psychoactive alkaloid.
Yes, mentioned because it's also psychoactive, has complex pharmacology including opioid interactions, and some animal data suggests it might reduce consumption. But the sources are extremely clear and emphatic about ibogaine's severe safety concerns.
What kind of concerns?
Significant risk of serious cardiac arrhythmias, heart rhythm problems, potential neurotoxicity, and documented cases of fatalities associated with its use.
And especially dangerous during withdrawal.
Critically dangerous, then. The body's already stressed. Introducing something with these kinds of heart and brain risks is extremely hazardous. The sources stress the absolute need for thorough medical screening, medical supervision, and proper detoxification before even considering ibogaine, which should only happen in highly controlled medical settings, if at all.
Okay, moving on. Canopinax sessiliflorus.
Another medicinal plant with traditional uses contains various compounds like triterpenoids, flavonoids. One specific compound, sculpirone, has shown anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving effects. Other potential activities suggested: antioxidant, anti-aging, antiplatelet, anti-tumor, benefits for glucose, cardiovascular, immune systems.
Traditional uses mentioned for fruits and roots.
Yes, for various ailments. But the key point from the sources: they do not contain direct studies on its effectiveness for reducing alcohol consumption, craving, or managing withdrawal in AUD.
So traditional background, some preclinical activity, but no specific AUD evidence presented here.
Correct. No direct link shown to changing alcohol use behavior based on this research.
Finally in this group, tryptophan and tyrosine, mentioned as precursors.
Yes, amino acids. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, tyrosine to dopamine, and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters are absolutely critical in AUD, involved in reward, mood, stress, all the systems that go awry.
Seems logical that boosting the building blocks might help, but the sources make a specific point.
They do. They state clearly that they do not contain information on clinical trials testing tryptophan or tyrosine supplements as direct treatments for AUD. When these precursors are mentioned, it's usually in the context of explaining how other drugs work by affecting these neurotransmitter systems.
So the brain chemicals are targets, but just taking the precursors isn't presented as an evidence-based treatment in these sources.
That's the distinction made. The research described focuses more on compounds that interact directly with the receptors or enzymes involved rather than just increasing the raw materials.
Okay, section 5 now. This is a really fascinating, rapidly developing area. Psychoactive therapies, specifically psilocybin.
Yes, psilocybin. The psychoactive compound from certain mushrooms, it's being seriously investigated for various mental health conditions, including AUD. And critically, it's not just given as a pill, it's administered together with structured psychotherapy. The whole package is called psilocybin-assisted therapy, or PAT.
The sources detailed some key clinical trials. An early open-label one first.
Right, Bogenschutz et al., 2015. Open label means everyone knew who got the psilocybin. But it was an important early signal. They gave moderately high doses alongside therapy and saw significant reductions in drinking over about 32 weeks. It really paved the way for more rigorous studies.
And then the big one, the Bogenschutz et al. 2022 Phase 2 randomized controlled trial with a later analysis in 2024.
This is the flagship study detailed here. Much more rigorous. Randomized, double-blind, so nobody knew who got what. And they used an active placebo-controlled diphenhydramine, Benadryl basically, which causes some mild sedation but isn't expected to have the same therapeutic effect. They enrolled 84 adults with moderate to severe AUD.
And the treatment involves psilocybin sessions plus therapy.
Yes, two main sessions where participants got either psilocybin or the active placebo. Doses were pretty substantial, escalating in the second session, given in a controlled therapeutic setting. And crucially, these sessions were embedded within 12 weeks of psychotherapy, including preparation before and integration therapy after the psilocybin experiences.
What were the results for drinking? They sounded quite striking.
They really were. The sources report that psilocybin-assisted therapy demonstrated rapid, robust, and enduring reductions in drinking behavior compared to the active placebo group. Specifically, sustained reductions in the average number of drinks per day throughout the entire 8-month follow-up. That kind of lasting effect in a phase 2 trial is quite promising.
And it wasn't just drinking that changed.
No, they also observed significant changes in personality traits in the psilocybin group. Reductions in neuroticism, that's tendency towards anxiety, negative emotions, and increases in extroversion and openness sociability, openness to experience. The later analysis also found that decreases in impulsiveness after the therapy were linked to lower drinking levels later on.
So it might be facilitating positive psychological shifts that support recovery.
That's the suggestion. That the therapy might be helping change personality and psychological factors in a way that supports changed behavior and long-term recovery.
And safety in this controlled setting.
Generally well tolerated in this context. That's the important qualifier. These studies involve careful screening, preparation, trained therapists present during the sessions, and follow-up integration. Very different from unsupervised use.
So the overall picture for psilocybin from these sources, significant promise in these early to mid-phase trials, showing robust effects on drinking and positive psychological changes, but only when combined with structured psychotherapy.
Absolutely. The assisted therapy part is key. It's the whole package. The substance likely facilitates a process that the therapy helps guide and integrate. Promising, yes, but the sources note we still need larger, confirmatory trials and longer-term follow-up to really understand the effects and prepare for any potential wider use.
Okay, wow. We have covered a lot of ground, from ancient herbs to novel compounds in these psychoactive therapies. Let's try to synthesize this a bit, reflect on the overall evidence picture from these sources.
Yeah, it's definitely a spectrum of evidence we've seen. Some substances really stand out with more compelling data presented, especially when you look at the human trials.
Right, like DHM. Strong preclinical stuff across the board, intoxication, withdrawal, consumption in animals, liver protection. That dual action, brain and liver, is really interesting. And that planned phase 1 human trial for liver disease, that's a big step towards human validation, even if it's not directly targeting AUD behavior just yet.
Kudzu, too. Some compelling human pilot studies showing reduced consumption, especially changing how people drink, the speed, the sip size. The ALDH2 mechanism is plausible, and that meta-analysis hint about reduced craving adds weight. Plus, ongoing trials show it's still being actively investigated.
And psilocybin, within that PK framework, genuinely promising results from that phase 2 RCT, reducing drinking and fostering those positive psychological changes, represents a really novel approach with exciting, though still early, data.
But then for many of the others we discussed, thyme, geranium, eagle, monoluma, sorghum, paganum harmala, acanthopanax, there's a pretty significant gap, isn't there, between the traditional use or the preclinical findings and the kind of robust, controlled human data you'd need for AUD outcomes.
Yeah, the evidence is often preclinical, or in vitro in lab dishes, or maybe focused on related things like anxiety or liver health, rather than directly measuring reduced drinking or craving in controlled human trials.
And the sources definitely highlighted the challenges in moving these potential therapies forward.
Like what?
Well, the complexity of herbal mixtures themselves, the natural variability, how much active compound is actually in the plant, can change based on where it grew, when it was harvested, how it was processed. That makes standardization really difficult, both for research consistency and for reliable clinical use. And as we kept saying, you just need those large, rigorous human clinical trials to really prove something works and is safe enough for widespread use.
And safety, we can't forget that.
Yeah.
Especially with natural products.
Absolutely paramount. The sources hammered home the serious concerns with some of these, especially the MAO inhibitors like paganum harmala and St. John's wort with those dangerous food and drug interactions. And ibogaine, with its severe cardiac and neurotoxic risks, particularly during withdrawal, it really underscores the need for extreme caution, medical advice, and supervision. That message, natural, doesn't automatically mean safe, came through loud and clear.
Finally, the sheer diversity of mechanisms we touched on, GABA, opioids, ALDH2, antioxidants, the stress axis, neuroinflammation, it really circles back to that starting point, doesn't it? The incredible complexity of ED.
It strongly suggests that a single magic bullet is unlikely. Targeting multiple pathways might be the key. Maybe that means combination therapies using existing meds, or maybe exploring these multi-component botanicals if they can be properly standardized and validated. It also points towards personalized medicine, trying to figure out who might benefit most from which approach based on their own biology or what's driving their AUD.
So we've journeyed through centuries of traditional knowledge, peeked into modern labs, and examined the early stages of rigorous human trials for this diverse set of potential treatments.
It's definitely a dynamic field. You see this mix of trying to scientifically validate ancient wisdom while also pioneering completely new biological targets. The search for better, more personalized AUD treatments is clearly pushing forward on many fronts.
And why does wading through all this detail matter to you, our listener?
Well, being aware of this whole range of approaches and being able to critically look at the evidence or the lack of evidence behind them, it's just essential for being well informed, especially today when supplements are everywhere, often marketed with big claims but maybe not much solid data.
Right.
Understanding that crucial difference between, say, a finding in mice or someone's anecdote versus data from a well-designed human clinical trial, that's vital for making informed decisions, for having good conversations with your doctor. It helps you separate the genuine potential from the hype, and crucially, helps you recognize potential safety risks.
That's a really powerful point. It equips you to navigate all the health information out there, understand what's actually backed by science, what's still exploratory, and what comes with serious warnings.
Exactly. Knowledge empowers safer, more informed choices.
So, here's a final thought to leave you with. Building on everything we've explored today, we see real promise in some traditional remedies and these novel targets, but we also see huge challenges in scientifically validating them through rigorous trials. How can we, as a society, best bridge that gap? How do we get potentially helpful but also proven safe and effective options to the people who desperately need them for a condition as complex as AUD? And perhaps, what responsibility do you, as someone navigating health information and maybe considering supplements, have in carefully weighing the claims against the actual evidence?
A complex question, absolutely, but a vital one for the future of AUD treatment and how we all engage with health research and information.